A new warning. Its chief says uncertainty is the new normal. That message comes ahead of next week's global economic meetings. The IMF says the world is not in crisis yet, but underlying risks are growing. From record gold prices to overvalued tech stocks.
The world economy is under pressure, and the warning comes from the top. The International Monetary Fund, the IMF, has issued a clear alert. Its chief, Kristalina Georgieva, says, "Buckle up. Uncertainty is the new normal." She made that statement ahead of the IMF's annual meetings in Washington. Finance ministers and central bank heads will gather next week. Georgieva says the global economy has stayed resilient so far, even with President Trump's tariffs and global tensions. The U.S. has avoided a recession, and global growth is expected to slow only slightly this year. But Georgieva says the real test is still ahead. There are clear signs of strain. Gold prices have hit $4,000 for an ounce. That's a record. And it shows that investors are nervous. U.S. stocks are also at extreme highs, driven by hype around artificial intelligence. But the IMF warns this may not last. So what are the deeper problems? The IMF points to long-term weaknesses in the system. Georgieva says the full impact of trade tariffs is still unfolding.
Ethiopia has just pulled off one of the boldest financial moves in modern history, and the entire world is paying attention. For decades, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank have shaped how developing nations borrow, spend, and grow. They were the gatekeepers of credit, the referees of global finance. But that system just took a massive hit, and it came from Africa. In early 2025, Ethiopia announced a deal that shocked financial observers across Washington, London, and Brussels. Nearly 80% of its foreign debt has been erased or restructured, and not through default, but through strategy. This wasn't luck. It was a calculated financial rebellion. Behind closed doors, Ethiopia spent years renegotiating with creditors, shifting alliances, and redefining how African nations engage with the global financial order. The result? A historic reduction in debt burden, one that could set a precedent for dozens of African nations trapped in similar debt cycles. And now, the world's biggest lenders, the IMF and the World Bank, are scrambling to understand what just happened. Ethiopia's debt problem wasn't unique, but its solution is. By 2022, the country was facing mounting foreign loans, inflation, and limited access to credit markets. Traditional IMF programs offered short-term relief, but came with strict austerity measures, reduced subsidies, higher taxes, and currency devaluation. For most countries, these were non-negotiable terms. But Ethiopia took a different path. Instead of accepting more Western debt, the government began working quietly with China, the African Development Bank, and Gulf partners to build leverage. Simultaneously, it launched homegrown productivity projects in agriculture, manufacturing, and logistics to prove it could sustain growth without IMF dependency. Then came the turning point. Ethiopia joined the G20 Common Framework for Debt Restructuring, but demanded that all creditors, not just Western institutions, share responsibility. This leveled the playing field. By mid-2024, Ethiopia negotiated write-offs and refinancing deals covering nearly $28 billion in obligations, much of it owed to bilateral lenders. The IMF was forced to agree, because Ethiopia proved that alternative lenders were willing to help without the same political strings. This was not just financial negotiation. It was a declaration of independence. When news broke that Ethiopia had erased 80% of its debt, analysts called it a financial earthquake. Western think tanks warned it might encourage a wave of African nations to challenge IMF frameworks. And they were right. Within months, Zambia, Ghana, and Kenya began exploring similar models of debt relief with BRICS and private African investors. For Washington, this raised uncomfortable questions. If countries could restructure their debts without the IMF, what role would Western lenders play in the future of Africa's economy? The U.S. Treasury quietly expressed concern that China and the African Union were creating parallel systems that could undermine the dollar's influence. But African finance ministers saw it differently, as a long overdue correction. In one Nairobi forum, an economist said, "For the first time, Africa is setting its own terms of finance. The IMF doesn't define our stability anymore, our productivity does." That quote captured the essence of the shift. Ethiopia's move sparked a wider discussion across the continent. The African Union began drafting frameworks for intra-African credit rating agencies, and talks resumed on establishing an African monetary fund, independent of Western oversight. In Lagos, Accra, and Addis Ababa, new economic corridors are being funded through BRICS partnerships and sovereign investment funds. Digital payment systems like Pan-African Payment and Settlement System, PAPSS, are bypassing SWIFT entirely, allowing trade in local currencies. These shifts may sound technical, but their impact is revolutionary. They reduce Africa's dependency on Western approval, interest rates, and global credit ratings. And Ethiopia, once seen as a struggling borrower, has become a symbol of economic defiance. The IMF and World Bank now face a credibility test. If more African nations follow Ethiopia's example, the global balance of financial power could shift toward a multipolar model, with African, Asian, and Gulf institutions at the center. Western lenders are already offering new incentives and friendlier terms to prevent further defections, but the narrative has changed. Ethiopia's message is clear: sovereignty comes before supervision. And as African nations coordinate on debt policy, the world is realizing this isn't an isolated event. It's the start of a continental movement. By rewriting the rules of finance, Ethiopia hasn't just shocked the IMF. It's inspired an entire generation of leaders who now see independence as possible, not impossible. Ethiopia's historic debt reduction sent shockwaves far beyond its borders. Almost overnight, finance ministers across Africa began revisiting their own debt structures. If Ethiopia could renegotiate 80% of its external debt, what was stopping others? In Ghana, Kenya, and Zambia, all of which have faced credit downgrades and IMF restructuring talks, the question became urgent. African leaders saw that a middle-income country, once heavily indebted, had found leverage. That leverage came from two things: strategic partnerships and domestic control of growth sectors. Analysts point to how Ethiopia diversified its alliances, working with Gulf nations, China, and African financial institutions, instead of depending on Western credit alone. This independence weakened the IMF's negotiating power, and it sent a message: Africa can set its own financial terms. Western economists worry that if more nations follow Ethiopia's path, the old model of global lending could unravel. African economies would gain flexibility, global lenders would lose dominance. In Washington and Brussels, the response was mixed. Publicly, officials congratulated Ethiopia for its responsible financial recovery. Privately, policy circles expressed concern that the IMF and World Bank's influence was fading. For decades, debt programs were tools of leverage, shaping policy decisions from taxation to subsidies. But Ethiopia's successful renegotiation showed that those tools could be bypassed through regional collaboration and alternative investment models. Reports from think tanks like the Center for Strategic and International Studies warned that this could redefine Africa's financial alignment. The concern wasn't just about money, it was about strategic control. If African nations are no longer bound by IMF conditions, they can freely trade, build, and align with any partner, including China, the Middle East, or BRICS nations. Meanwhile, investors began re-evaluating risk across Africa. Ironically, debt relief improved confidence. Ethiopia's fiscal space increased, meaning more funds for infrastructure, agriculture, and technology. This combination of growth potential and financial independence made Ethiopia one of Africa's most watched economies of 2025. Debt relief alone doesn't solve everything, but for Ethiopia, it was a reset button. By clearing 80% of its debt, the government suddenly had room to reinvest in real development. Energy projects like the Grand Renaissance Dam are expanding power exports to Sudan and Kenya. Industrial parks are reviving manufacturing, while new logistics corridors connect Addis Ababa to Djibouti and beyond. Domestic production is rising, meaning fewer imports and a stronger currency base. Ethiopia is also pushing digital reforms, using mobile finance and tax automation to improve revenue collection. At the same time, Addis Ababa is reforming trade laws to attract African partners, not just Western corporations. It's a subtle but powerful pivot, turning Ethiopia into a model for post-IMF Africa. African Development Bank officials now call it the Addis strategy. Restructure debt, build locally, trade regionally, and invest in growth sectors that reduce dependency. The results are already visible. Economic growth projected above 6%, inflation stabilizing, and investor confidence improving. Ethiopia's move to erase 80% of its debt wasn't just a national milestone. It marked the beginning of a continental awakening, the realization that Africa's growth no longer depends on old financial systems. For over half a century, debt defined Africa's relationship with the world. It limited decisions, delayed development, and drained national budgets. Now, Ethiopia has proven that negotiation, backed by strategic unity, can break that cycle. The IMF and World Bank still have influence, but they're facing a new reality. Africa is no longer a passive borrower. It's becoming an active architect of its own financial future. This shift won't happen overnight, and it won't be without challenges. But what Ethiopia demonstrated is historic, a major African economy standing up, rewriting the rules, and walking away from decades of financial dependency. And as more nations watch and learn, the question becomes, who's next? Because this isn't just Ethiopia's victory. It's a signal that the balance of global economic power is starting to move southward. And that, more than anything else, is what has the world's financial giants truly worried.